When historians examined a forgotten photo from 1836, they didn't expect much until they zoomed in. What they found would expose a buried truth so shocking it could shake the very soul of America. Smash that like button, subscribe for more untold history, and drop a comment if you're brave enough to face the truth. Just after noon in the quiet town of Fairbrook, a young courier arrived at Dr. Draco Glenmore's office with a plain brown parcel in hand. The delivery interrupted a lively conversation between Draco and his colleague Dr. Silas Featherstone over mugs of black coffee and the latest academic gossip. Draco, a meticulous man in his late 50s, pushed aside his ceramic cup and took the package, a puzzled look settling over his features. "Did they say who it's from?" he asked, but the courier merely offered a shrug before gesturing at the clipboard. Draco signed, then watched the boy disappear down the steps without a word. Silas arched a brow. "Should we open it or wait for it to start hissing?" Draco smirked, but his fingers trembled slightly as he unwrapped the package. Inside, wrapped in layers of tissue and time, was a daguerreotype, an early photograph on a fragile metal plate. The image had been recovered from the remains of a once grand estate, just outside town, now reduced to rubble and ivy. A note from the Fairbrook Historical Society. Silas read aloud, squinting through his glasses. "Looks like they want your expert eye on this one." Draco chuckled under his breath, but the sound came out broken and dry. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and turned the photograph toward the daylight, streaming in through the tall windows. The faces of 5 young boys stared back at him, suspended in a moment nearly 2 centuries old. Captured with the eerie sharpness typical of daguerreotypes, the boys stood shoulder to shoulder, likely aged between 12 and 16, all dressed in threadbare but cared-for linen. The background was softly blurred, typical of early photographic depth, but the subjects themselves were startlingly vivid. Draco's breath hitched. There was something unsettling in their faces, a flicker of memory he couldn't quite name. He reached for his magnifying glass and examined each boy in turn. "What is it?" Silas asked, noticing the sudden stillness in Draco's posture. Draco didn't answer right away. His gaze was fixed on the first boy on the left, a wiry figure with untamed brown hair braided back in 4 loose strands. There was a glimmer of mischief in his half-smile, though his cheeks were smeared with dirt. His simple attire was grimy but not neglected, suggesting someone who got into trouble but always found his way home. Beside him stood a boy of similar build, and age his expression more subdued but clearly connected. Their shoulders brushed lightly, the kind of closeness that spoke not just of friendship but blood. The third boy in the center stood slightly taller, with honey-blonde hair pulled carelessly into a short bun. His eyes narrowed toward the camera, not in amusement, but in defiance. There was something brewing behind that gaze, something dark and unresolved. Draco noted a pale hand resting on the boy's shoulder, and it wasn't hard to imagine tension simmering just beneath the surface. The fourth boy bore a quiet gravity. His face was sharper, darker, and thoughtful. His eyes seemed to take in everything, not just the lens, but the person behind it. His jet-black hair was slicked back severely, casting an even starker contrast against his deeply tanned skin. Something about him read like a witness, not a participant. But it was the final figure, the boy farthest to the right, who seized Draco's full attention. His smile was wide and unguarded, revealing slightly crooked teeth and a kind of boyish joy that defied the grimy exterior. His skin was lighter, his cheeks still round with youth, and though dirt smeared his forehead, his expression glowed with life. His hair, more lustrous than the others, was caught up in the same messy knot, but appeared softer, healthier somehow. "Looks like some kind of school gathering," Silas murmured, studying the background. "You think there's something more to it?" Draco asked, setting down his magnifying glass and rubbing his temple. The Historical Society's request had seemed routine at first, but now he wasn't so sure. For the next 2 hours, the two men passed theories back and forth, comparisons to other known families, scanning features for matches, checking clothing styles for hints of class or origin. Then, during a second pass under magnification, Silas leaned closer and drew in a sharp breath. "These two," he said, pointing to the last boy and the one next to him, the dark-skinned child with watchful eyes. They're brothers. Look at the bone structure, the ears. It's unmistakable. Draco raised a skeptical brow. Two boys of different skin tones. In 1840s America, it sounded like another of Silas's stretches until something inside him clicked. A memory. A story. Draco snatched the photo and peered at it again, heart beginning to race. He crossed the room, climbed a stepladder to a high shelf, and pulled out a thick, worn tome, a volume of Fairbrook genealogical records stretching back to the earliest settlers. The office filled with the dusty scent of old paper and anticipation fell silent, but for the rustle of turning pages. Judging by the boy's clothing, the photographic style, and the backdrop, Draco could tell this daguerreotype had likely been taken sometime in the mid-1800s. That gave him a starting point. A vague memory surfaced something his grandmother once told him about a peculiar family that had lived in Fairbrook in the 1830s. He began thumbing through the local archive hand-copied birth records, town registers, and well-worn genealogical charts. Then there it was, the Collier family. 5 sons born between 1830 and 1833. He whispered their names as he read them from the record. Elias born 1830, Samuel 1831, Caleb 1832, Matthew also 1832. He paused, recognizing the implication. Twins, he murmured. His finger slid to the last entry. And Jonah, born 1833. Draco leaned back for a moment, piecing it together. According to the records, the Collier boys had been well known in Fairbrook, not just for their kindness, but for the uniqueness of their family. Jonah the youngest had been adopted as a baby after his mother, a recently freed black woman, died during childbirth. The Colliers, devout Quakers and active supporters of the Underground Railroad, had taken him in and raised him as one of their own. There was no distinction made in the household. The boys were raised as brothers in every sense of the word. The bond between them had been strong by all community accounts, and Jonah was dearly loved. Draco's eyes returned to the photograph, now illuminated with a new layer of understanding. The closeness between the boys, the way they leaned into one another, how their shoulders brushed, how they half-smiled in silent camaraderie, it wasn't posed. It was real, unmistakably familial. Well, you cracked it in a single day. Silas chuckled from behind, glancing over Draco's shoulder and plucking the heavy ledger from his hands. How's the Historical Society going to survive without you? Draco gave a small eye roll, but his lips curved with faint amusement. Silas continued reading the notes aloud, and his voice began to falter. The Collier family died in a house fire, winter of 1847. All 5 sons and both parents. Whole community went into mourning. Draco closed his eyes for a brief moment. He could almost hear them, the harmony of their voices at church recitals, the clapping at town fairs. The boys had been known not only for their good nature, but also for their music. They often played together at community gatherings, stringing joy into every note. A heavy silence crept between the two men as the realization settled. They were holding the only surviving image of 5 young men who had grown up in a house that dared to defy the norms of the time, a home built, not on sameness, but on choice and compassion. In an era when racial blending was still taboo and even dangerous, the Colliers had carved out a different kind of legacy, one of quiet rebellion through love. Draco's phone rang, cutting through the quiet like a sudden gust of wind. He reached for it absent-mindedly. Dr. Glenmore, he answered. Hi, this is Paloma McKinley from the Fairbrook Historical Society. Just wondering, did you get a chance to look at the photo we sent over? Yes, Draco said slowly, his voice thick with meaning. Paloma, I think we've come across something truly significant. This isn't just some forgotten portrait. What do you mean? He explained the records, the story of the Collier brothers, their unique family history, and how the photograph fit into it all. There was silence on the other end, thick and stunned. My God, Paloma whispered finally. You're telling me we have photographic evidence of a racially integrated family in 1846, nearly 2 decades before the Civil War ended. Exactly, Draco said. And not just integrated, bonded. Loved. He glanced again at the image, seeing now not just 5 boys, but 5 souls bound by something deeper than blood. But questions lingered. Where had this photo been taken? What were they doing? Why were their clothes dirty, their faces smudged, their expressions a strange mix of joy and weariness? It wasn't just the fact of the photo that fascinated Draco, it was the context behind it. He began to study the details more carefully. The way one boy's hand protectively hovered behind the smallest's back, the tension in the middle one's jaw, the subtle melancholy in the tallest brother's eyes. The photograph didn't just capture a family. It hinted at a story still waiting to be unearthed. The slight crumple in Elias's trousers hinted that he had been restless, perhaps growing impatient with the long, uncomfortable stillness early photography demanded. Samuel's hand hovered near Matthew's shoulder in a subtle yet instinctive gesture, the kind shared between brothers when one has always played the protector. Meanwhile, Matthew's solemn gaze didn't quite meet the camera lens. It seemed angled just off to the right, as if his attention was caught by something or someone behind the photographer. And Jonah, beautiful, composed, Jonah stood tall with the self-assuredness of a boy who had never been made to feel like an outsider. There was no trace of a smile on his face, and the expression he wore, especially when seen beside Matthew's, hinted at something much deeper than discomfort, something like quiet sorrow. Dr. Draco Glenmore leaned in closer, the photograph trembling slightly in his gloved hands as he adjusted his magnifying glass. With heightened focus, the hazy background he had initially dismissed as indistinct shapes began to sharpen. Those weren't just random children blurred by time. They appeared uniform in age, similarly dressed in rough, simple clothes, and their posture spoke not of spontaneity, but of order, as if they were part of something organized. Draco's voice dropped to a whisper. "Silas, take another look at this. Really look, Dr. K." Featherstone adjusted his spectacles and leaned over his friend's shoulder. "What am I supposed to be seeing the children in the back?" Draco murmured. "They're all about the same age. And look right here in the corner." He pointed to the faintest scratch on the metal plate. With the strongest lens in his collection, they could barely make out a tiny etched inscription. 8/15/1846. Silas read slowly. August 15th. That's more than a year before the fire. Then why do they look like... Draco trailed off the answer, forming even before he could speak it aloud. Impoverished, Silas offered softly. "Exactly," Draco said, his voice heavy. "Why do 5 boys from one of the wealthiest Quaker families in Fairbrook look like they've been living out in the woods?" Suddenly galvanized, he turned back to his records, not to the family trees this time, but to the town's newspaper archives from the mid-1830s. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he scoured the digital microfiche database, eyes scanning one headline after another. Then his hand froze. There it was. In a forgotten article dated the fall of 1836, he found it. A report detailing how a local Quaker household had intervened in the rescue of 14 children from an illegal holding site on the outskirts of Fairbrook. The family, the Colliers. Draco's stomach churned as he read on. Due to their involvement in the Underground Railroad, the Colliers had uncovered a horrific situation at an abandoned estate where children, some as young as 8, were being held in cruel, degrading conditions. It was believed they were being trafficked through false indenture contracts sold off to labor farms out of state. Silas paled. "Dear God," Draco continued. Among the rescued were 12 children of various racial backgrounds. Some mixed race, most kidnapped, all bound for what officials had hesitantly termed a form of child trafficking. The Collier brothers, Elias, Samuel, Caleb, Matthew, and Jonah, had played an active role in the rescue. According to the article, they remained at the estate for 3 days, caring for the traumatized children while authorities organized their relocation to safe homes. Now everything fell into place. The dirt smeared across their faces, the frayed clothes, the weight in their eyes. These weren't images of neglected boys. They were young men who had chosen to stand in the middle of something dangerous, something painful, in order to help others. The photograph hadn't captured poverty, it had captured purpose. They weren't victims, Draco said, voice thick. They were protectors. He scanned the final part of the archive. It noted that the daguerreotype had been commissioned by the Collier family, not as a keepsake, but as documentation, legal evidence. The photographer, one Jeremiah Hartwell, had been a traveling abolitionist sympathizer who offered his services for free, believing the image might be useful in court proceedings. The photo was intended to testify, not to memorialize. "This isn't just a family portrait," Draco said slowly, the full weight of realization pressing down on him. "It's a historical document, proof of one of the earliest recorded child rescue efforts tied to human trafficking in U.S. history. And those children in the background? Those were the ones they saved. Silas sat back heavily in his chair, overwhelmed. No wonder the Historical Society wanted us to examine this. Do you think they knew? I doubt anyone knew the whole story, Draco replied, eyes still locked on the photograph. But look at this last entry. All 14 rescued children were eventually placed with caring families across the city. The illegal trafficking operation was dismantled, and multiple arrests followed in its wake. What the Collier family accomplished wasn't just an act of bravery, it became the blueprint for child protection efforts that wouldn't formally emerge until the establishment of organized orphanages many decades later. The two historians sat frozen, their eyes locked on the daguerreotype, as if they were seeing it for the first time. Those 5 boys, the eldest, no more than 16, had risked their safety and their lives to protect children who had no one. And in doing so, their family laid the moral foundation for the very orphanage system that Fairbrook's Child Welfare Services would adopt generations later. The fire, Silas said abruptly, his voice low and grim. The house fire that took all of them in 47. Draco felt a cold weight press against his ribs. He dove back into the records, searching through municipal court reports and investigative notes from that winter. What he uncovered made his breath catch. The official inquiry that followed the blaze in February revealed suspicions of arson and possible retaliation tied to the family's testimony against the trafficking ring. They were murdered. Draco whispered the words scraping out of his throat. They saved those children, and someone took their lives for it. He blinked back tears as he gazed once more at the photograph. The young faces staring out from the silver plate were no longer simply figures from history. They were brothers, Elias, Samuel, Caleb, Matthew, and Jonah, who had laid everything on the line for a cause greater than themselves. They weren't just the sons of a prominent Quaker family. They were young men of extraordinary resolve who chose justice over safety and empathy over silence. This isn't just evidence of a blended family, Draco said slowly. It's proof of a rare, radiant courage most people never even read about, let alone live. Silas nodded, his voice hushed. This changes everything we thought we knew about the roots of child welfare and about what young people were willing to do in that time. Draco gently slid the daguerreotype into its velvet-lined, protective case. His hands were steady, but his voice carried the weight of reverence. And it reminds us that some bonds deeper than blood, stronger than skin, and tougher than death were forged in that little house in Fairbrook. Those boys had likely stood still for the camera, unaware that the image would someday shine a light on a chapter of American history long buried by time. They had no idea that this frozen moment would echo nearly 2 centuries later. When Draco called Paloma back, his tone was calm, even as emotion welled beneath it. We're going to need to prepare for something much bigger than we expected, he said, and so began a month-long effort to curate an exhibition unlike any other the Fairbrook Historical Society had undertaken. Historians, scholars, and experts from across the country traveled to examine the photograph for themselves, questioning whether the story truly warranted such attention. But in the end, none of them doubted its value. Dr. Glenmore and Dr. Featherstone had been right all along. The exhibit would open with a new title plaque, The Collier Brothers, 1846, Heroes of the Underground Railroad and Pioneers of Child Welfare. In saving others, they redefined what it meant to serve. In risking everything, they shaped the future of America's orphanage system. And in the quiet corner of the display, nearly hidden unless you knew where to look, were etched the names of 14 children whose lives had begun anew the moment 5 brave young brothers decided that love mattered more than fear. What a stirring story of selflessness and moral courage. What about you? Would you risk it all to protect someone else, even if it meant challenging the world around you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time with another untold piece of history.